Hi everyone, I'm Robert Moody. I am the principal conductor of the Memphis Symphony Orchestra, and we're talking now about the second Classic Accents concert over at GPAC in Germantown, happening in January of this season. It's going to be a great concert, bringing to town one of my very favorite artists, one of my favorite singers, and yes, one of my closest friends to be part of this concert experience. The concert opens with Stravinsky's Pulcinella Suite. Pulcinella was a ballet for which Stravinsky wrote music during the First World War. We had a concert earlier in which Aaron Copland wrote Appalachian Spring for 13 instruments, and he wrote this during the Second World War. Well, Stravinsky, during the First World War, did very much the same thing. He went from writing pieces that would take 70, 80, 90 players, like The Rite of Spring, and then the First World War happened, and he gave us a number of really gems, incredible pieces of music for much smaller ensembles. So this is written for a chamber orchestra, and it is actually evocative of a Baroque theme. So he's actually looking back to music that really was written 200 years prior and giving this incredible early classical Baroque feel to Stravinsky. So people hear the name Stravinsky and they think of sort of all of the grit of The Rite of Spring. Pulcinella is the polar opposite. It's almost like listening to a wonderful work by Handel with this great sort of ingredient of Stravinsky thrown into it. It's one of my favorite pieces, the Pulcinella Suite, and it also features several members of the orchestra very prominently as soloists, and I enjoy that we get to do that as well. The second piece on the concert is a piece called The Songs of the Auvergne by CANTELOUBE. CANTELOUBE was a great French composer, early part of the 20th century, and he wrote a number of these songs of the Auvergne region of France. They're folk songs that come from this region. Some of them are so lovely. The Bayero is one of the most famous of these songs. So you'll get to hear a set of these songs sung by mezzo-soprano Elizabeth Bishop. Elizabeth Bishop won the Metropolitan Opera vocal competition in 1994. She went on to sing lead roles at San Francisco Opera, Chicago Lyric Opera, Houston Grand Opera, Washington National Opera, the Met, Covent Garden, La Scala, you name it, the great companies of the world, Betsy has performed there. Betsy has actually sung lead roles at the Met over 70 times at this point in her career. I'm very proud to tell you that I've known her since she and I were 6 years old. We grew up together. We met in the first grade. Actually, we both remember meeting in the first grade spring play. I was the MC of the spring play at Duncan Chapel Elementary School in Greenville, South Carolina, and Betsy was a jonquil in the flower scene. We've been great friends ever since. We started playing string instruments together, I on the cello, she on the violin in the fourth grade. We both were singers. In fact, both of us went to Furman University on identical full scholarships. The only time that the university has ever given 2 full music scholarships was the year that we went to college. I in voice and cello, she went in voice and violin. She eventually moved on to become the great singer that I have described to you. So no one knows me like Betsy Bishop, and I would say no one has fun with me, maybe even at my expense, than Betsy Bishop. But it's great to have a friend that you've known for that long and you still get to work with. We've worked together on many, many concerts, and I'm very excited that she's coming to Memphis and you get to meet my great friend as well. We're finishing the concert with perhaps the greatest classical symphony, or at least the classical symphony that was chronologically at the peak of the classical era, the Beethoven Second Symphony. Beethoven wrote 9 symphonies, as you probably know. The most famous ones are the Fifth Symphony, the Ninth Symphony, and then probably after that, the Third, maybe the Sixth or the Seventh. One would not usually mention the First or the Second Symphonies in that list, although I have to tell you, the Second Symphony of Beethoven is one of my very favorite. The Second Symphony of Beethoven could just about be called Mozart Symphony No. 43. Wolfgang Mozart, sort of the king of the classical era, this perfect form of classical music. Mozart wrote 41 symphonies. He actually met Beethoven, we think, at one point when Beethoven was a very young man and Mozart was not much older, but it was soon before Mozart died, quite young, in his 30s. So we know they met, or we think they met at least one time, and it seems that Beethoven took the mantle from Mozart, also from his teacher, Haydn, and moves classical music forward, at least in his early composition. So the first symphony of Beethoven sounds like it could be a successor to the Mozart symphonies. The second symphony of Beethoven seems like an even more perfectly fleshed out feeling of the classical era. It was right after that that Beethoven began to lose his hearing, and this seems to have moved him in a different direction, and by the third symphony we see the first bits of the Romantic era come into music. So here we are at the Second Symphony, celebrating the greatness of classical music. The concert begins with Stravinsky Pulcinella Suite, celebrating great early classical music by a 21st century composer. It ends with the Beethoven Second, the pinnacle of the classical era, and in between, incredible French songs by Canteloube, sung by mezzo-soprano Metropolitan Opera star Elizabeth Bishop, who also happens to be my great friend for almost my entire life, Betsy Bishop. Hope to see you at the concert.